Yeah. Our next speaker is John Ladson. And John is, there's a change in the program. John is speaking next. And John is, also no stranger to the ARI. And he's the author of several books about this area. And, all right, so the title of John's talk, the formal title is The Origin and Lifeways of the Aucilla and Wacissa Rivermen, circa 1900 to 1940.
Right.
Thanks, John.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. McFadden. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning in the historic Monticello Opera House. I've wanted to see the interior of this building for years. I've ridden past it I don't know how many times, but I never envisioned that the Aucilla Rivermen would be my ticket. So here we are. I have a lot of material to cover, a lot of slides, and I'm going to have to move through this quickly. So I apologize for maybe having to move a little quickly and have it read from my narrative. But anyway, maybe I won't leave you in a daze or put you to sleep. But my mission is to share with you some history about the men and their families who primarily derive their livelihoods from the natural resources of the Aucilla and Wacissa River basins circa 1900 to 1940. For simplicity moving forward, I'm going to refer mostly to the Aucilla because, as you will see, the Wacissa is its tributary. Let's start by taking a look at some geography and running down the Aucilla River. Originating as a series of wetlands near Thomasville, Georgia, and running south as a drainage way, it reaches the Florida line where it begins to evolve into a true flowing river. Moving on across the sector known as the Cody Scarp, lime rock becomes the river's most prominent feature. Continuing toward the Gulf of Mexico, it abruptly disappears into a sinkhole. Then it runs underground through its limestone channel, traced by a series of sinkholes until it surfaces to flow freely once again. This unique pattern of disappearing and rising to reappear is repeated a number of times, such that the Aucilla has been called the River of Many Faces. As the river reaches Taylor and Jefferson counties, we encounter an important and beautiful landlocked segment known as the half-mile rise. Shortly before it dives into a siphon and returns underground, there is an intersection with the Wacissa where it flows across a rocky shoal called the Race. We need to pause here for a moment and talk about the Wacissa River. Fed by numerous springs near the town with the same name, it flows cold and crystal clear for roughly 13 miles before branching into several channels. One of these, called the Slave Canal, heads more or less to the south and traverses a vast swamp known as the Western Sloughs. Another one runs into the Aucilla at the Race, as you have just seen. The unique feature of the Slave Canal is its link with the lower Aucilla, which provides access to the Gulf of Mexico. By circumventing the land bridges across the Aucilla, it becomes a shortcut, which was recognized by the area's early plantation owners. Around 1830, they launched an effort with slave labor to convert this channel into a commercial artery. It never succeeded, and soon nature reclaimed it as a quiet, serene stream, but one that could be utilized by the rivermen as a travel way and a fishery. Looking briefly at our map again, may be helpful to give you a better perspective. Returning to the siphon at the half-mile rise, we follow the Aucilla underground until it rises once again and runs for a mile as Little River, until it terminates and submerges into a whirlpool. Soon it rises for the final time at a small community of Nuttall Rise to make its 7-mile trek to the Gulf. Traveling down the river, it forks at Little Ward's Island, forming the east and west runs. If you enter the west run at the fork and travel a short distance, you come to the intersection with the Slave Canal. After the east and west runs reunite, the Aucilla moves quickly past several landmarks. Around 1921, the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf Railroad, or the Lope and Gopher, as it was called, reached the river and crossed it just below the Mandalay Lodge and boathouse constructed in 1934 by businessman Thomas Puckett. The railroad and lodge were assets for the Rivermen because the fish house was installed along the railway crossing, and excursions from the lodge required local guides who knew the river, the adjacent territory, and the Gulf Flats. The Aucilla still has a well-deserved reputation for treacherous navigation, and it was even more difficult circa 1900 to 1940 before the Corps of Engineers attempted to improve it. Moving on past Mandalay, there's a very narrow passage through a rocky sector at Bird Island, and then the present boat landing, public boat landing, is reached on the east bank, known originally as Swift's Camp. Its history is sadly obscured by its function as a parking lot and ramp. Roughly 1,500 years ago, Native Americans inhabited this site, as evidenced by a large mound which was unfortunately destroyed by subsequent construction activity. Aside from our Native Americans, some of the earliest rivermen operated from here. The names Swift, Strickland, and Lewis reach back to the period shortly before 1900 to the 1930s. The public landing is also remembered as the Williams Fish Camp, which was located here circa 1940s to the early 1950s. To finish up the Aucilla journey, we move into the shallow Appalachia Bay area called the Flats. Two rivers of interest flow into this sector, the Econfini to the east and the Pinhook to the west. Both are small streams, but will be mentioned in conjunction with the Rivermen, along with St. Mark's, whose lighthouse can be seen from the mouth of the Aucilla on a clear day. Now that we have an overview of the river itself, a description of the adjacent basin lands is in order. It will not surprise you if the one word that comes to mind is wet. The region is rife with creeks, sloughs, marshes, sinkholes, and ponds, but is interspersed with higher hammocks dominated by oaks, magnolia, cabbage palm, spruce pine, and other species. Circa 1900, it was an isolated wilderness, but rich in resources, including great virgin stands of timber and bountiful wildlife, waterfowl, fresh and saltwater fish, deer, turkeys, bears, alligators, Florida panthers, Everglades kites, and the ivory-billed woodpeckers were all present. The region was a natural paradise and sparsely populated by scattered homesteaders. Living conditions were difficult at times, with periodic floods, hurricanes, and all kinds of pestilence, including ticks, redbugs, yellow flies, sand gnats, and venomous reptiles. Communication and access were extremely limited with very few roads, and travel was difficult. However, forces were building that would have a tremendous impact on the area. They were generated from several sources, but the major drivers were the timber boom and the Great Depression. The timber boom in the Taylor and Jefferson County region was accompanied by the growth of the naval stores industry. Both generated employment and migration along with exploitation of the local woodlands, but the timber boom had a far greater impact on the Aucilla and Wacissa basins. Industrial scale logging and sawmills moved from the Great Lakes region into the southeast and Florida around 1900. Given its extensive longleaf pine and cypress forest, Taylor County and Perry attracted huge investments in sawmills and logging operations. Millions poured in from investors as far away as Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, and Louisiana. The world's largest cypress mill was constructed by the Burton Schwartz Company, and the mammoth Brooks Scanlon operation at Foley was the largest sawmill east of the Mississippi. Railroad expansion accompanied all of this, with tram feeder lines penetrating even the remote Aucilla wetlands, and logging communities like Scanlon developing nearby as well. The Great Depression began in 1929, intensified in the 1930s, and ended with the onset of World War II. By this time, the timber boom prosperity in North Florida was starting to decline, due primarily to the exhaustion of the forest resources. This was further exacerbated by the softening demand caused by the Depression and the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. Soon, the timber boom was over. So the question is, what did all this have to do with the Aucilla Rivermen? The answer relates largely to migration. Some of the rivermen, especially from South Georgia, were initially drawn to the region by the employment opportunities, originating with the lumber industry shortly after 1900. Others with roots in the area reaching back to the 19th century also worked periodically with some of the logging companies. So this was an additional impetus for them to stay in the region. As the timber boom faded, the Depression lingered on, and the area's rich game and fish resources afforded an opportunity to more or less live off the land for those with the requisite skills. Consequently, a combination of forces both attracted and held the Rivermen families. Because of its access to the Gulf and the lower Aucilla and Nuttall Rise, and the Nuttall Rise community became the epicenter of the Rivermen's activity. Not a lot is known about the history of Nuttall Rise. It is named for William Nuttall, who bought the land at the rise of the river when Florida became a U.S. territory. Aside from a few homesteaders in the area prior to 1900, the enclave appears to have largely developed in concert with the timber boom and recreational fishing and hunting. The names Kinsey, Ward, and Chansey are several that are identified with the 19th century days. During the subject period 1900 to 1940, other names become prominent, including Paget, Hartsfield, Brown, Blue, Williams, Lewis, and Gill. We're going to talk about some of these individuals shortly, but let's cover what they shared in common. First, they all lived in a very isolated, remote area. In spite of the timber boom, there was no paved road access into Nuttall Rise until US 98 highway was built in 1952. It was 23 miles to Perry, 34 miles to Tallahassee, and very little in between. Basic foodstuffs and supplies were not readily accessible. Prior to 1950, there was no electricity or telephone service, and despite the intrusion of the timber boom, which eventually faded away, the people living along the Aucilla River were not far removed from the pioneer era in many respects. By necessity, they had to be self-sufficient in a lot of ways. They planted gardens and utilized the local game and fish resources. They possessed many rudimentary skills and were inventive. For example, they built boats, housing, traps, and various paraphernalia. Needless to say, the Rivermen were highly adept watermen, woodsmen, hunters, and fishermen with copious knowledge of the region's wilderness. Within their ranks, formal education varied, but most had at least some grade school education. So how did they earn money? As previously mentioned, they found periodic employment in the private sector, primarily the timber industry. But without question, they considered themselves commercial fishermen, as consistently shown in the federal census data. This livelihood was driven by what I call the mullet trade. Mullet was a staple food item for North Florida and South Georgia, and the great runs of those fish from October to early December supplied the demand. The Rivermen used specially designed boats with a platform for a long gill net at the stern and power provided by oars, or in later years by outboard motors, forward of the net platform. When a school was detected, the net was struck or cast, and the school was trapped. Then began the arduous task of pulling in the netted fish, which would later be processed and stored in barrels with layers of salt for preservation. This was not an easy way to make a living, and it went on both in the day and at night. In addition to commercial fishing, the rivermen found employment as recreational hunting and fishing guides and caretakers for absentee land and cottage owners. They also ran livestock, mainly hogs, through the local woods, periodically capturing them in traps. The Prohibition years from 1920 to 1933 provided another somewhat colorful employment opportunity. The remote setting and clean waters of the Aucilla and Wacissa territory were perfect for the production of illegal whiskey. Evidence that it flourished among the rivermen is provided by an interview with resident Lem Hartsfield, which was published in the December 6, 1970 edition of the Tallahassee Democrat newspaper. In that article, Lem says, and I quote, "Things got so bad around here at one time, people used to have to wear a badge to keep from selling moonshine to each other." End of quote. The Wacissa Slave Canal was a favored location for at least one still, known as Circa. Situated on a beautiful creek, the site was littered for years with rusting cans, which had once contained locally produced cane syrup. The syrup was used as a substitute for sugar in the fermentation process. While on the subject of the Slave Canal, illegal activity and fishing, there's another story that speaks to the ingenuity of the rivermen. The clear, shallow water of the canal and its sandy bottom segments offered a unique and efficient condition for arranging a fish trap. As described by Drayton Paget Jr., a gill net assembly roughly 60 yards long was laced along its sides with telephone wire and laid out across the bottom. This was then rigged with ropes to a pulley mechanism above and suspended between trees. The control rope was taken to an elevated platform along the bank and connected to a pole for leverage. A man on a platform could clearly view the canal and the passage of fish. At the opportune moment, he could partially raise one end of the net to block the entire canal, and the fish would begin to stack over the trap. Then, by jumping off the platform with pole in hand, he could activate the entire assembly such that it would rise from the bottom, enveloping everything over it, and literally suspend in midair a large catch of fish. The operator's body weight coming off the platform, combined with leverage from the pole and pulley, supplied the requisite energy. The fishermen would then bring their wooden skiffs nearby and use a dip net to transfer the catch, which would be transported to ARI for processing and salting down into barrels. During the run season, there might be more than one of these traps in operation, and the rivermen working together would camp along the canal, often on the higher ground of the ancient Native American mounds. Finally, in speaking about the rivermen and what they had in common, it's important to recognize that the families living in the ARI's area were in many cases closely related. Mobility was limited and neighbors intermarried over several generations. So what you really have with the rivermen in this 1900 to 1940 period is a band of people, many of whom are blood connected, living largely in a world of their own. And it is a world that has a captivating beauty and natural richness, but is also periodically afflicted with difficult and challenging living conditions. Over the years, those challenges formed an alliance, which made survival often dependent upon mutual help and cooperation. This is not to suggest that everyone lived in perpetual love and bliss, but rather that, in general, folks got along and helped one another when it counted. Before we wind up by talking about some of the individual rivermen, I want to mention the women. Most of these men were successfully married to women who birthed multiple infants in a wild region with no reliable medical care. Assuming they survived childbirth, they then had the primary responsibility for raising children in a difficult environment. They also had to run a household vulnerable to random flooding, not to mention assisting their husbands with hard physical tasks. While I admire the men and their talent in the outdoors, I have a greater admiration and respect for the women, whose endurance and dedication anchored their families. So, with appropriate tribute paid to the ladies, let's talk about some of the individual rivermen, starting with Benjamin Lewis. Migrating probably from Alabama in the 1890s, Benjamin settled near the mouth of the Aucilla at Swift's Camp, which, as mentioned earlier, is now the public boat landing. It is believed he was attracted to this area by the abundance of red cedar, which he cut and shipped to Cedar Key to supplement his subsistence livelihood from local fish and game. In 1902, he was documented as living in a crude structure with a thatched roof. Later, he built an improved residence, but his tenure on the river was marked by tragedy with the loss of his first wife and baby during childbirth. The only church cemetery was miles away, and a flood prevented travel such that he had to bury them in the high ground of his yard, where they remain in graves now unmarked. Cephas Lewis, the son of Benjamin Lewis, was born in 1905. In his youth, he helped his father cut red cedar logs. Working for a timber company in later years, he lost one eye in an accident. However, most of his life was spent at Not All Rise working as a guide, caretaker, and commercial fisherman. R.C. Balfour's book, In Search of the Aucilla, contains a brief story about Cephas that was told to him by his friend Theo Titus. It goes as follows, and I quote, "Cephas was blind in one eye, but got around in the swamp like it was his own backyard. Theo said that when Cephas needed meat, he hunted deer at night, a customary practice in the flatwoods. One night he was standing beside his vehicle with his headlights on when a game warden stepped out of the bushes, demanding to see his hunting license. Cephas replied, and I quote, 'Well, I can't recollect whether I put it in my right barrel or my left. But just stand there and I'll fire them off and you can see which one it's in.' End of quote. The warden quickly decided he had business elsewhere. Julian Paget was born in Georgia in 1878 and at an early age moved to Taylor County, Florida. Sometime after 1920, he moved to Not All Rise, where he developed a cafe, guide service, and rental housing, catering to sportsmen. His son, Drayton Paget, and grandson, Drayton Paget Jr., also guided on the river and flats. Julian and his family were identified with Not All Rise and the Aucilla River for many years. Perhaps one of the most interesting and well-known rivermen was Aaron Brown. Aaron was born in 1898, most likely in Taylor County, but his story begins with his father, Asa, also called Ace Brown. There are different accounts of how Ace Brown came to Florida. Aaron said his father migrated to the Econfini River from West Georgia around 1879 and married Margaret Stanley. Ace's grandson, Richard Williams, passes on a richer version in Annie Lou Giles' biography, Wacissa Rivermen. Richard states that Ace had Creek Indian blood and was probably from Alabama. He further says that for reasons unknown, Ace walked into a church one day in Macon, Georgia, and killed his uncle. As a fugitive, he found his way to one of the wildest areas in Old Middle Florida. So you can choose whichever account you prefer, but Aaron and Richard agree that Ace soon settled his family in the most remote spot you can possibly imagine, in the beautiful and obscure, along the beautiful and obscure Pinhook River. It flows into Appalachia Bay not far from the mouth of the Aucilla. Raised with his siblings in a small home with a roof of thatched palmetto fronds, Aaron lived there until he was 17. By age 14, he considered himself a commercial fisherman, and as he advanced into adulthood, he became a market hunter, selling alligator hides, venison, and other game. He stood about 5 feet 8 inches tall with a medium build, brown hair and blue eyes, personable, and a good storyteller. He could also play the guitar. Somehow he managed to get through the 3rd year of grade school. As a young man, he would occasionally pole his wooden skiff up the slave canal and all the way to the head of the Wacissa, where there was a fish house and a store. On one of these trips, he heard about a frolic planned at the Story family home not far away. The parents were off on a visit in Georgia to see relatives, and the Story young folks were hosting a big party. Somebody supplied the music, and the parents' scuppernong wine livened the event. Aaron was given a key to the smokehouse containing a barrel of the wine and was delegated the task of keeping a bucket full on the back porch where everyone drank liberally from the same dipper. Aaron said he danced until the girls had to put him to bed. After a couple of days of this nonstop merriment, the sunlight reached his bleary eyes one morning, and he knew it was time to leave because no one wanted to be around when the parents came home. In 1928, he married Mary Lee Strickland from a local clan with a long history along the Aucilla. Residing mostly in St. Mark's, their union produced 4 girls and a boy. Aaron fished in the Aucilla, Econfini, Pinhook, St. Mark's, and Wacilla rivers, while occasionally working on barges in the Gulf. He survived close calls with 5 major hurricanes, but nearly died one night alone at a campsite on Rock Island below the mouth of the Econfini River. While mullet fishing, he became violently ill from consumption of food that had been accidentally contaminated with poison. Drayton Paget happened to be fishing nearby and saw his boat anchored at the island. Fortunately, Drayton found him in time to run his fingers down his throat and induce vomiting, which no doubt saved his life. Aaron went on to roam the woods and waters for many years. When he passed away in 1984, the region lost one of its most knowledgeable and engaging rivermen. The name Ephraim or Eph Williams appears in Jefferson County as early as 1856. The 3rd Eph Williams was born in 1900 and settled with his wife and children on the west bank of the Aucilla River, across from the old Lewis place, now the public boat landing. Typical of other rivermen, he was a commercial fisherman and free-range hogs and cattle. When the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge was established around 1933, the Williams home was taken by eminent domain and the family was forced to move elsewhere. In that same year, state archaeologist Clarence Simpson found them living on a Native American mound along the slave canal called Coon Bottom. They were housed in a cabbage fan hut and slept on beds made from ropes and saplings and mattresses stuffed with Spanish moss. Simpson also noted the presence of a garden planted on the mound. Apparently, this was one of several camps the family utilized at various seasons, depending upon the abundance of fish and game. Eventually, Eph was hired by Thomas Puckett and worked for him as a caretaker at Mandalay. Puckett also acquired the Lewis place, where Eph's sons, Bill and Lawton, later operated the Williams Fish Camp and guide service. Late in life, Eph became a Pentecostal holiness preacher. The Williams name remains prominent in the annals of the Aucilla Rivermen. Remarkably, there was one permanent home located on the slave canal. Frank Gill, born in South Georgia in 1871, migrated to Wacissa, Florida, sometime prior to 1920, and eventually married Aaron Brown's sister, Irene. The 1920 census documents his employment as a dealer in salt fish. By 1926, Frank erected a dwelling on the east bank of the Slave Canal, near its segment known as Blaze Cabbage Shoals. It is described as a wooden frame house with a tin roof and a runway out to a detached kitchen in the rear. I suppose having been raised along the Pinhook River, moving on to the canal was not a leap too far for Irene, but it is hard to exaggerate their living conditions. The only dependable access was by water. Essentially, they lived in the middle of a vast swamp infested with mosquitoes, yellow flies, water moccasins, alligators. Bears and wild hogs were their neighbors. How they and all those living in the adjacent wetlands avoided malaria is difficult to fathom. Any trail leading back to Not All Rise had to cross multiple sloughs with water waist deep at times. By 1930, Irene had passed away. It defies imagination, but not long thereafter, Christopher Columbus Lewis, called Lum Lewis, his wife Lily Mae, and their several children moved in with Frank Gill. Incredibly, by 1940, Lily Mae had given birth to 4 or 5 more children in this isolated and dangerous environment. Sadly, but not surprising, they lost a 2-year-old toddler who drowned in the canal. Census data also shows Lum as a commercial fisherman. By 1942, Frank Gill and the Lewis family were gone from the canal. Today, only a stray piece of tin reminds us that a family once lived there. James Lewis was one of the children. As mentioned earlier, Lem Hartsfield, born in Taylor County in 1912, was an early resident at Not All Rise, and like the others, was a commercial fisherman and guide. Lem's older brother, Pinckney, was also a well-known Aucilla riverman who made a living mullet fishing, working trot lines in freshwater, and guiding. R.C. Balfour interviewed him in conjunction with his book. Pinckney related that in the days before he owned outboard motors, he would have to row his fishing clients out to the Gulf, a distance of about 8 miles, and then to various locations on the flats. Of course, he had to row them back at the end of the day. For the entire trip, he was paid a total of $7. Circa 1930 to 1940, Pinckney stated that his mullet catch would bring 2 to 6 cents per pound. In addition, he operated a restaurant at Not All Rise for a number of years. The building remains, but was converted into a cottage long ago. Lem's sons, Bud and Billy, also worked as guides. Billy was killed in Vietnam, and the U.S. Highway 98 bridge over the Aucilla is named for him. To wind this up, I'll mention one last character who was known as Cheeseland, which I suppose was his surname. He was a dwarf who made his living by guiding and paddling boats for river fishermen. Typically, his clients would be seated in front of a wooden boat, casting lures or pitching live bait with a cane pole toward the bank. Occasionally, this endeavor would result in an errant delivery, whereby the sportsman's fishing line would get tangled in overhanging tree limbs, vines, etc. Invariably, as Cheeseland would paddle over to deal with the mess, he would say, and I quote, "The fish ain't biting, but the squirrels is." End of quote. Squirrel fishing. I've become quite adept at it. An acquired skill that just gets better with age. I asked longtime Not All Rise resident Jack Simpson, well, what became of Cheeseland? He said Cheeseland got up one morning and proclaimed to all those present that Not All Rise and the adjacent area was going to be sucked into the earth and become one huge sinkhole. He left and was never heard from again. So with that little story, you'll not hear further from me this morning unless I can answer some questions.